Welcome back, traders. In this lesson, I'm going to quickly break down how you can identify supply and demand zones using one of my favourite tools, the Shivved V5 supply and demand indicator. Now, this indicator automatically marks out supply and demand zones for you in real time, saving you hours of manual chart work. It's a great visual guide to spot potential turning points and see where institutions might be active. But here's the important part, and this is where your skill as a trader comes in. While the indicator does a great job highlighting zones, it's not perfect. Like any automated tool, it can sometimes mark areas that don't truly represent institutional orders, especially around messy consolidations or extended trends. That's why in this video, I'll show you how to use Shiv V5 as a starting point and then filter the zones manually using price action logic. You'll know exactly how to combine automation with trader intuition, letting the indicator do the heavy lifting while you make the smart decisions. Let's jump straight into the charts and I'll show you how to separate real zones from the noise using the Shiv V5 indicator. So let me introduce you to what I call the three-step review process. First, we're going to delete any incorrect or confusing zones that Shivved has marked on the chart. Then we're going to adjust the zone edges to reflect the proper imbalance points, which Shivved won't always be able to get correctly. And then finally, we're going to manually add in any missing zones. Let's jump into the first example. So when I load up my USD Japan 1 hour chart, the very first thing you'll notice is that there are quite a few supply and demand zones automatically marked by the Shivved indicator. And that's completely normal. The indicator's job is to identify potential imbalance areas based on predefined rules. But here's something very important. Just because a zone is detected does not mean it deserves to stay on your chart. This is where step 1 of our 3-step zone review process comes in. We need to delete any incorrect or confusing zones that Shivved has marked on the chart for us. What I'm doing now is going through each zone individually and clicking the small X to remove the ones that don't quite align with what I'm looking for. Some zones are technically valid according to the indicator's algorithm, but structurally they may be quite weak. Others may sit inside messy consolidation structures that we don't need to see. Once I've cleaned up the unnecessary zones, the next step is refinement. Now, since the zones are drawn algorithmically, they may be slightly too wide or not perfectly aligned to the base candles. This means we need to use the adjustment tool to drag the top and bottom edges so the zone tightly wraps around the key points. Now, I'm not adding anything new here, I'm just adjusting the zones that are already there. You'll see me slightly dragging the edges of some of these remaining zones, and the reason for that is precision. For supply zones, I want the zone to properly cover the true origin of the imbalance, not just where the candle body started drifting lower, but where the real displacement began, the moment price shifted from balance to aggressive selling. And on the upper side, I'll often extend the zone to the nearest meaningful swing high, because that's where the liquidity was resting before the move. For demand zones, it's the same logic, just inverted. I want the lower boundary to align with the nearest swing low, the point where liquidity was taken before the buyers stepped in. And the upper boundary should accurately capture the start of the bullish imbalance, where price left with strength. Now that we've adjusted our zones, the last step is to manually add any supply and demand zones that might be missing from the chart that Shivved hasn't automatically marked for us. In this case, just below the 155 psychological level, there's a very clean demand zone. Now, notice that the Shivved indicator hasn't picked this one up automatically. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to manually draw the demand zone just below 155. And I'm going to anchor it at the origin of the imbalance, right where price transitioned. I'm including the portion of the base that actually caused the move, not just randomly boxing candles. And the important part here is that when I draw this zone manually, it carries the exact same information display as the automatically identified zones. You still get the zone data, the metrics, and the pip labels. Now, let's move to the next example. I've just added the Shivved V5 indicator to my GBP USD chart, and immediately you'll notice the same thing as before. Multiple zones all appear at once. That's not a problem. That's the indicator doing its job. It's scanning historical price data and flagging every area that technically qualifies as a supply or demand based on its internal rules. But again, not every automatically marked zone deserves your attention. So the very first thing I do isn't to look for trades, I reduce the noise. I step back and ask a simple question. Does this zone actually represent meaningful imbalance? Or is it just a technical formation inside a messy structure? You'll see me clicking the X on zones that don't make sense in the broader context. Some of them may have a small departure, but no real displacement. Some sit in the middle of a consolidation, meaning they were never responsible for actually breaking the structure. Others are stacked too closely together, creating clutter instead of clarity. See, that's the key. The indicator shows you possibilities, but your job is to identify probability. Once the unnecessary zones are gone, what remains is a structured, readable map of GBP/USD, not a battlefield of random rectangles, all vying for your attention. Now that the unnecessary zones are removed, we're back to refinement. So what I'm doing now is adjusting the edges of the remaining GBP/USD zones so they better reflect two things: where the imbalance actually started and where liquidity first came into the market. Let's start with supply. When I look at a supply zone, I'm not just asking where did price drop, I'm asking where did the selling pressure truly originate. Often the indicator will mark the last bullish candle before the drop, but sometimes the real story starts slightly higher, at the swing high where liquidity was resting. That swing high is important. That's where stops are clustered, that's where breakout traders entered, and that's where liquidity was available. Very often, that's where institutions began positioning before the aggressive move down that created the zone. Now it's time for step 3. Add any manual zones that the indicator has failed to mark. If you look at the most recent price structure, you'll notice that there's a supply zone just above 137,100. Price rallied aggressively into this area, printed a sharp rejection, and then immediately sold off. That tells us there were unfilled sell orders sitting there. The move away was clean, decisive, and impulsive. Exactly what we want to see when identifying fresh supply zones. So I'm going to mark this zone manually as supply, as the tool's not going to mark it. This 137,100 region now becomes a tactical area. It's not the higher time frame institutional ceiling, but it's a near-term distribution pocket. Alright, let's bring this all together. The biggest mistake traders make with any supply and demand tool is thinking the tool does the thinking for them. It doesn't. Shiv V5 is built to save you time. It scans the structure, detects imbalances, and gives you a clean starting framework. But the edge doesn't come from the indicator. The edge comes from how you refine. If you follow these 3 steps every single time you open a chart, the indicator becomes a powerful assistant, not a crutch. And over time, you'll start seeing supply and demand zones automatically, even without the tool being on the chart. That's when you know your skill is actually developing.